During the winter, Indiana is one of the cloudiest states in the whole country. So when the sun comes out, it can feel so good. It can also be pretty dangerous. We wanted to get into more of the weeds, the science behind UV index. We're not just here to say, hey, put the sunscreen on. We wanted to kind of show you the science behind the sunscreen and the UV index and very specific information just for Indiana. It's kind of just interesting because it's not just about the UV index in our skin, but it has to do with how much light is coming towards plants and even solar panels, a lot of different things. Our whole weather changes because of this one thing. The angle of the sun. I'm 13 News meteorologist Matt Standridge. Every single day the sun is at a little bit of a different angle. It's either getting a little bit higher in the sky or it's getting a little bit lower there at solar noon. That's the top that the sun will be for a given day. When we're during the winter months, sun's a lot lower. In fact, in Indiana, it only gets 27 degrees above the horizon. Yeah, we're getting a little bit into geometry class here, but that's not very high. In fact, we have kind of a little bit of a golden hour throughout much of the day just because the sun is so low. Now, as we progress past the winter solstice, which is where the sun is at its lowest angle at 27 degrees before Christmas, as we get into the new year and we go all the way to June for the summer solstice, that is when the sun angle is at its highest. And here in central Indiana, that is 74 degrees. That is a huge difference over the several months that we go all the way into the summertime. And then after the summer solstice, it starts going back down again. Yeah, even some of our hottest months, July and August, even in parts of September, the sun angle is actually getting a little bit lower in the sky. But we don't really notice it really as much until we get more into September and October. And then, of course, we're back into the wintertime and we're back into the clouds, especially due to Lake Michigan keeping us cloudy throughout the colder months. So what about this UV index? How is it even calculated? Because we've got this scale and sometimes we say, hey, we're at a 9, we're at a 10, watch out. What does that even mean? Well, it's a combination of a few different things. It's not just the sun angle, which that is probably the primary part to it. We also have to look at the stratospheric ozone concentration. Know how we've been talking about for decades, really, the ozone hole and how the ozone's been depleted, but then it's also been being restored. That's the good news the past several decades. That's been awesome. But the concentration of ozone can also change the UV index. When it's a little bit better, you've got better concentration, we're actually protected a little bit better. So that's why there's a big to do there in the 60s and 70s and 80s talking about ozone. So we've seen some improvements, but the concentration at any given day, and that's modeled by the U.S. government, we factor that into the equation. We also take a look at cloud cover forecasts because especially when you get thick clouds, you block that sun. In fact, it is just bouncing off the top of the clouds and going right back to outer space. So if you're flying, you know, the clouds may be kind of gray here by the ground and you're looking up, you see the gray skies, but you get an airplane, you go right on top and they are just brilliant white, right? And they're just reflecting that light back into space. So cloud cover is a big deal. Also, elevation of the ground. If we're closer to sea level, your UV index is actually a little bit lower because the sun has to travel a little bit farther to the surface. Now, if you're on top of a mountain, you can actually have a really high UV index. A lot of folks, like let's say in the winter, you're skiing, you take things off because you're hot out there, you've been working hard going up and down those mountains, you can get a sunburn because you are higher up, closer to the sun. Not by much, but you are closer to the sun. So all these three factors really go into the UV index. Let's talk a little bit more about cloud cover because Indiana, you know, we go from basically just cloudy day after cloudy day to much more sunshine. June, we have 45% of our days are cloudy. So you flip that around, 55%. So more than half the time we are sunny. Here's that 50% mark right here. Once we get to July, August, and September, we're down in the 30s. That means about 60 to 70% of the time we are sunny. Only 30% of our days have clouds in them there in August, at least mostly to overcast for those skies. But once we get into fall, we start getting those clouds back. October, up to a 40% chance of clouds, but then it really skyrockets into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then we're right back into our gray pattern. We completely flip-flop all these cloud percentages. So when we get more sunshine, you get just more of a UV index. Now, June technically has our highest solar angle, but June is also our wettest month of the year. That's typically when we get our biggest downpours before we go into our dry season. So sometimes our UV indexes are actually worse in July and August, even though the sun angle is as high. It's high though, but it's not as high. but we have fewer clouds going there into the heart of summer. This is another way to look at those UV indexes, and we've kind of calculated a little bit of that cloud forecast percentage in there, just a wee bit. So June technically still has our UV index being the highest when you're on a sunny day, but we just get more of those high UV index days, especially in July and August. You can kind of see the downtrend, and that all has to do with the sun angle in the sky. The higher it is, the more it beams down on you. Okay, so now we got those numbers, but what do those numbers even mean, and why do we care? We say at a 9, a 10, what does that mean? Well, we've talked to dermatologists, and this is just another way to look at it, and I think this is a more helpful way, because if you just say, hey, UV index 11, watch out, what does that mean? Well, we can take a look at sunburn times, and these are kind of average times. Everyone's skin is going to be a little bit different. When you're at a 7, you start getting those sunburns. We actually start getting that UV index of a 7 in the early spring. You can get sunburn if you're out there a really long time in March and April. Those are kind of the surprising sunburns as you're trying to, on a nice day, finally get out and into the yard. UV index of 8, 30 minutes, that's all it takes for a sunburn, and then we get really low times here for 9, 10, and 11 for the UV index. When you're at 11 or higher, you can get a sunburn in 10 minutes. It is really fast if you don't have any protection. And speaking of protection, you see the bottles and they say 15, 30, and maybe say 500. I don't know how high they go. But what do those even really mean? Technically, the EPA says you need at least SPF of 15, so that gives you 93% protection. But a lot of dermatologists these days are saying get the SPF 30, and you can see there's a slight increase. You go up to 97%, but generally the recommendation is once you hit SPF 30, you can get stronger SPF, but you're really not doing very much. You go all the way to SPF 50, you're at 98% coverage now. So you've only gained 1%. So this is really up to you, but they really say as long as you hit 30, you're pretty good. If it costs a lot more to get the SPF 100, 200, 300, I don't know how high they go, you may not be worth the money, but put on the sunscreen to help you out, because especially in the middle of the summer, boy, that sun angle is high. We cook here in Indiana. Also dries out our soil, gets us back into drought mode if we don't get too much rain. So all these factors play into the sun angle and is the main driver of our weather, but it's also the main driver of why we get the sunscreen out and we put that on.